Thank you, Judge. Thank you, jury. I would like to begin by defining sin. Sin, according to Noah Webster, in paraphrase, is any act that breaks a moral absolute or breaks any law that is put in place by God. Because we have such a definition, and because we know that the Puritans based most of their principles off of what is biblical, we can then assume that the trial will be judged based off of what is morally and biblically correct. Myself and my partners advocate that our client, Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, is less guilty or less sinful than his opponents, Miss Hester Prynne and Dr. Roger Chillingsworth. I would like to address a passage in chapter 3, page 63 of Nathaniel Hawthorne's book, The Scarlet Letter, where Mr. Hawthorne clearly states that my client is, quote, tremulously sweet, rich, deep, and broken, end quote. I would now like to jump to the entirety of chapter 11, the interior of a heart, that claims that my client is the sole character in the entire book that expresses any sort of repentance of his sin. Because of Noah Webster's definition of adultery, in paraphrase, adultery is an act by which a married person commits any sexual or intimate relationship with a person that is not their married spouse, we can affirm that my client, Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, is not an adulterer, but rather a fornicator, thus dismissing any argument that my opponents could make that he is or did commit adultery with Miss Hester Prynne. Miss Hester Prynne directly violated God's law in the 8th commandment of the law of Moses in the Pentateuch of the Bible in Exodus 20 that states, "Thou shalt not commit adultery." Because she directly violated God's law, disobeyed God, and sinned against her still living spouse, Dr. Chillingsworth, we can then see that Miss Hester sins against God and sins against Chillingworth. Dr. Chillingworth, according to Romans 12:19, directly defies God because Romans 12:19 section B states, "Vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord." According to chapter 5 of Nathaniel Hawthorne's book, The Scarlet Letter, we see on page 70 that Dr. Roger Chillingsworth seeks vengeance on whoever Miss Hester Prynne's secret lover is. And again, because of Romans 12:19, we see that Roger Chillingworth directly disobeys God, thus sins against God and sins against Dimmesdale. Also, if we want to be technical, according to the English Standard Version, 1 John 3:15, in paraphrase, the verse states that any person that has hatred in his heart for his brother is a murderer and has committed murder towards that person in his heart. If the judge sees fit, we can then press the charges of murder against our opponent, Mr. Roger Chillingsworth. If the judge does not see fit, we could still assume the position that he's committed sin against God by disobeying God and having hatred and vengeance in his heart towards my client, Reverend Dimmesdale. So we see that Reverend Dimmesdale has sinned solely against God, whereas Miss Hester has sinned against God and sinned against Chillingsworth, and Mr. Chillingsworth has sinned against God and against Dimmesdale. Because of this, you can affirm that my client, Reverend Arthur Dimmesdale, is less sinful and less guilty than his opponents, Miss Hester Prynne and Dr. Roger Chillingsworth. Again, I would like to thank the judge and I would like to thank the jury.